Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany Singh and I'm the founder and host of Empathy Gaps, an online YouTube video podcast. Welcome to episode 15. Grief is a universal and natural response to loss. When someone is grieving, their brain's amygdala is oversensitive and cortisol levels can increase. Common symptoms of grief include numbness, emotional pain, and inability to perform daily tasks. In this episode, Dr. Kaplow and I will discuss everything you've wanted to know about grief, including the good, the bad, and the question that everyone wants to know the answer to. How do we get over grief? Here is my conversation with her. Hi everyone, and welcome to Empathy Gaps, an online video podcast focused on creating a safe space to discuss mental health and psychology, while also working to address the needs of the current mental health crisis. I'm Tiffany Singh, your host, and today we have a very special guest, Dr. Julie Kaplow. Dr. Kaplow is a psychologist who specializes in grief and adolescent/child psychology. She currently serves as the Executive Vice President of Trauma and Grief Programs at Policy at the Meadows Mental Health Policy Institute, Executive Director of the Trauma and Grief Center at the Hackett Center for Mental Health in Houston, and Professor of Psychiatry at Tulane University. Thank you so much for being here today and taking the time to join me. Before we start, is there anything else that you want to add regarding to what you do and who you are?
No, I think that was it, but thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course. As the first question, I kind of wanted to ask you like your inspirations and what kind of inspired you to like specialize in helping others with grief and dealing with the loss of a loved one. And if possible, we please also tell us a little bit about your work and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Sure. Well, I guess backing up a little bit, I think what really prompted me to get into this field was an experience that my mother had that was sort of passed down to me in a way. So, when she was fairly young, she was only about 26 years old when her own father died. And I was just a baby. I was 6 months old. And, I remember even from a very early age, her talking about how she used to rock me to sleep while sobbing over the death of her father. And I also remember her telling me, as I grew older, about how difficult that was, that she didn't have a chance to say goodbye, that she, really missed him and didn't really have closure around that. And so I kind of tuned into that very early on and became very interested in grief and what is a good goodbye and how do you maintain a healthy connection with the person who died, while also being okay psychologically and in terms of your well-being. So long story short, that is what prompted me to move into the field of really grief. And I had the opportunity as an undergrad to work with a professor named Al Kane who studied bereaved children. And at that time, I still can't believe he gave me this opportunity, but I was only a freshman and he allowed me to conduct interviews with children who had lost a parent. And I think that really also got me very intrigued by what does grief look like in children? What does resilience look like after a death? Starting to recognize that some of the kids seemed to be doing really well, other kids were really struggling, and what kind of explained that difference. And so that's what really got me started thinking about grief as not just a clinical interest, but also a research interest. So now going to present day, I've been very fortunate to have worked with several mentors who helped me to really think about the interplay between trauma and grief. And that is what my body of work now constitutes, is really thinking about post-traumatic stress, grief, how they are similar, how they are different, and what happens when children are exposed to traumatic losses. And so I lead, as you said, two trauma and grief centers. And there we focus on developing interventions for kids who've experienced trauma or loss. We do research looking at the impact of those interventions. And then we disseminate those interventions through training people in the community, including parents and how they can best support kids who've experienced trauma or loss.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really like the personal connection, and I feel like that's what inspires a lot of people to go into, I guess, like mental health and psychology. And I kind of wanted to ask you more about grief and its impact on mental health. So, how has your like understanding of grief and its impact on mental health evolved or like changed over the course of your career?
Yeah. I think when I first started in the field, grief was sort of pathologized, at least in the academic medical centers that I was in, where, we were focusing on diagnosing kids with prolonged grief disorder or PTSD or other things that were coming up for them. And what I've come to learn is that grief has a healthy or adaptive counterpart to it, that it's not just about suffering and pain and sorrow, but it can also be about finding healthy ways of connecting to the person who died, living the legacy of the person who died, making meaning of the loss, or even transforming the circumstances of the death into something that can help other people. So, all of these aspects of grief that are sort of more adaptive or healthy were really being ignored for a long time. And so I think that's really how my thinking has evolved, is thinking about grief as multidimensional, multifaceted, both, painful and also growth promoting. And when we are, developing our interventions and thinking about how best to support grieving kids, we're always thinking about how do we reduce the pain, but also enhance and harness those adaptive grief reactions that are naturally occurring.
Yeah, of course. I think if we like get so stuck on thinking as grief of such a negative thing, I think sometimes it can hinder our healing. So I'm glad that there's also another component of grief, which is like the growth that happens and the strength that like someone finds in themselves when dealing with grief. And I kind of wanted to ask you, I know grief, as you talked about the negative part, how can dealing with grief kind of interfere with daily activities, and how could like grief also potentially like manifest into a bigger issue, like for example developing into depression?
Yeah. In our research, we have found that there are really three primary grief-related challenges that kids experience, and I would say probably the same goes for adults, but our research has really focused on youth. And what we find is that most of them struggle with separation distress, that's yearning or longing for the person who died. They struggle with existential or identity distress. So, who am I without this person? Or how am I going to get through life without this person? And they also struggle with circumstance related distress. So, being very preoccupied with the way the person died or how they died. So, I wish I could have intervened, or I wish they didn't have to suffer so much. And I would say that the way we see it impacting mental health in general is that all of those things can lead to longer term depression. They can lead to impairments in functioning. Kids can be so devastated by the loss and so stuck on wanting to be reunited with the person that they can't get out of bed in the morning. They can't go to school. They can't do their homework. And so, all of those three different struggles that they have can be addressed through either peer support sometimes, or familial support, or if they're very severe, then through therapy. But I would say that those are kind of the three primary ways we see that interacting with mental health in general.
And I noticed that when you answered the question, you like use the word like you reference kids a lot. Is there kind of a difference in like how like I guess like kids cope or are treated with grief rather than like adults or like older people?
Yes. So I would say that that's another way that I think the field has really evolved. So I think originally, kids were almost treated like mini adults. So, it was sort of assumed that they grieve in the same way as adults do. And we have now learned that that's actually not the case. And, oftentimes with children in particular, grief can manifest in lots of different ways. One way that we hear about very frequently that's a little different than what we see in adults is that kids can sort of come in and out of their grief very rapidly. So, for example, they might be sobbing 1 minute and then playing outside another minute, and they're actually fine. And they come inside, and then a few minutes later, they're sad. So they kind of go in and out of that a little bit more rapidly than adults do. We also see differences in terms of what they become preoccupied with, right? So, as a child, if you lose a caregiver or a parent, that has a very different impact than if you are an adult and you lose a spouse. So kids' worries after the loss of a parent include things like who is going to, help me with my math homework? Who's going to take me to, my basketball practice? Or for adolescents, much more future oriented thoughts like, how am I going to get through college? Who's going to walk me down the aisle? Whereas with adults, obviously the worries and concerns look very different. And so that's why in the treatments that we've developed, we've really tried to tailor them according to the child's developmental stage and really honing in on, what are their concerns? What are their needs as opposed to here's an adult treatment and we're just going to downward extend it to kids.
Yeah, I'm really glad the field is starting to I guess like separate kid treatment and adult treatment because obviously kids have like they're like different they're like not as like struck like brain wise and stuff. They're like not as like grown out. I guess I feel like that's not the right word, but yeah, I'm really glad that treatment is starting to focus more separately on kids and adults. And regarding like grief and like children, how does like grief impact children, I guess, and how can it like impact their development and stuff?
So grief can impact children in many different ways. And I would say that, you know, the take home message is really that bereaved children will still go on to lead healthy, happy lives. So we don't want to suggest that if a child is bereaved, then their future looks really dim, right? We know that that's not the case, that the majority of bereaved kids will be resilient and will be okay. I would say for those kids that are really stuck in their grief, that may not have the social support that they need, that may have struggled with prior mental health issues, those kids may be more at risk. And what we see with those kids are, if they don't get treatment, is that they can fall into relationship problems or school problems or significant depression or anxiety or even suicide risk. So that's why, we're very focused on early identification. So we have several screening tools that we've developed that can actually identify kids who might be most at risk after a death and ensure that they get the treatment they need as quickly and as early as possible.
Kind of pivoting off of that, like what are some tools and strategies that we can employ to like help someone deal with grief? Or like how can we support loved ones going through grief?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think the first thing I would say is that it's important to talk about it. So I think because we are always so worried about saying the wrong thing to a grieving person, we don't say anything at all. And that can make it really hard for the grieving person. They feel forgotten or neglected, or like somehow no one really understands what they're going through. So I think bringing it up and, and there's sort of this mistaken notion, like, I don't really want to go there because I don't want to upset the person. But what we find time and time again is that it's extremely validating for the grieving person to talk about the person who died, or to be asked about the person, or even to simply say, I've really been missing your brother a lot. I'm sure that's so hard for you too. Or, I laughed to myself when I thought of your dad the other day. So really openly talking about it is key. I think the other thing we do a bad job of as a society is that we are so quick to want to fix the problem that we don't really allow people to express their pain. So being able to bear witness to someone's pain is so hard to do, but it's also so necessary and can be very healing for the person who's grieving. So literally being able to sit and listen to them cry or talk about how much they miss the person is incredibly important and helpful. I think for kids in particular, helping them to find ways of connecting to the person who died can be extremely helpful. So things like, planting flowers in honor of their mother, or doing things that they used to enjoy doing with the person, and making note of that, that even though the person isn't here physically, we can still feel connected. Another thing that adults can do for kids is reminding them of all of the positive traits or characteristics that they have in common with the person who died. So, your mom was so funny and so are you, or your dad was so talented at playing the piano and look, you have that same talent. So helping them to understand ways in which they can sort of carry on the legacy of the person is another thing that we can do.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think you are right in the sense that I feel like a lot of people are scared to say the wrong thing, so they won't say anything at all. But yeah, I feel like for people dealing with grief and just like watching the people around me deal with grief and my own grief, I feel like it is important for there to be like a support system and stuff. And I feel like it's good. Like even if you don't like know what to say, I feel like it's still good to like show your support and stuff. And now kind of on the flip side, what are some tools and strategies that like someone can develop to combat with their own grief if they have, I guess, kind of like a lack of like therapy or other like resources?
Yeah. There are some great resources out there that they can access independently, even without a therapist. So, one is there is a website called the Shared Grief Project. And this was developed by someone named Todd Arkey, who basically took it upon himself to interview lots of famous people who had experienced the death of a loved one. And it's amazing. It's like this video archive of famous basketball players and sports people and rap artists and singers, songwriters who have all experienced bereavement. And it's them talking about how they were able to get through it. We've used that a lot with, especially with teenagers who may be a little hesitant to talk about their feelings, but who then all of a sudden see their favorite basketball player talking about how it's okay to cry, and it really changes how they're able to address the grief. So that's one that I would recommend. The other is a documentary that was created called Speaking Grief that follows several families through their journey of grief and really helps people to understand what is needed after a death and how other people can help support them, but even what they can do for themselves to help themselves get through that experience. Um, we are in the process of creating an online coping tool for kids who've experienced bereavement that's not ready yet, but we will be certain to let you know when that's ready. But there are those things out there that I think can really help.
Hmm. And so far, have you seen kind of a trend in like AI and helping people deal with grief, or do you think that's still something that like has to wait a while for it to like be popular?
Yeah, I have not really delved into that too much. It makes me a little nervous that it's not a human
Yeah, yeah,
offering
yeah.
support, but that could evolve. Certainly, it could evolve over time. I just don't know very much about that, to be honest.
Yeah, I think definitely right now I feel like AI, I know there's probably like a lot of people trying to create like AI therapy bots or like AI support bots, and I feel like I'm very interested to see and like where that'll lead because I know AI is such a controversial topic, like it makes some people scared and some people really excited. So I'm
Yeah.
really like excited to see, I guess, where AI and stuff and like grief and stuff can go. And the last question that I wanted to ask you is, I know going back to your like specialization about child grief, so are there any techniques that specifically like kids or children can use to deal with their own grief?
No, that's a great question. There are lots of skills that we can give to kids to be able to deal with their own grief. One activity that I often recommend to kids is writing a letter to the deceased person, telling them everything that they want to say or anything that they felt like they wanted to say and didn't have a chance to say. And the key here is not just writing the letter to them, but then writing a letter back. So pretending that they're the person that they're writing the letter to, what would they imagine the person saying back to them? And that can be incredibly healing, believe it or not, to be able to kind of think about, well, what would they say to me and what advice would they have for me? So that's one activity that I would suggest. I think the other is just simply identifying what feels supportive to you, right? So is it hanging out with friends? Is it going for a walk? Is it listening to music? Is it going to the cemetery and visiting the person's grave site? It can vary for each person, but I think being able to identify what it is that helps you to cope is a key piece of that.
Mhm. Of course. So thank you so much, Dr. Kaplow, for coming on and speaking with me. It was great listening to all your advice surrounding grief and coping strategies and stuff. So I'm really thankful that we got to talk about this today. I'm sure a lot of people need these resources or would be very like happy to use these in the future. And yeah, is there any like last comments that you want to say, like any social media or websites that people can follow up on?
Thank you so much, Tiffany. I would say that if people are interested in learning more or would like resources for themselves related to both trauma or grief, they can go to our website, which is just tagcenter.org. And we have a virtual learning library that has freely downloadable webinars, resources for parents, resources for kids. We even have that screening tool online. So if someone is concerned that maybe they do need therapy after a loss, they can just simply answer the questions on the screening tool and it will actually tell them, this is for kids, by the way, if they need a more thorough evaluation.
Of course, that will be in the show notes. And yeah, once again, thank you, Dr. Kaplow, for coming on and speaking with me. And I will see everyone next time. Bye.
Thank you.